Welcome to Coping with Ghosting, the podcast that provides hope, healing, and understanding for anyone who's been ghosted. I'm your host, Greta, and today's focus is on a research paper called Ghosting, Social Rejection Without Explanation, but Not Without Care, published in Journal of Experimental Psychology General in 2024 by YeJin and Nadav Klein, both of whom are with me today. Welcome to Coping with Ghosting.
Good to be here.
Thank you so much for inviting us, Greta.
I'm beyond grateful that you are here. I think this is such an interesting paper and a lot of research needs to be done in this area. So good on you for tackling it. And I'd love for you to please share a little bit about the work that you do and what led you to research ghosting. YeJin, if you would want to begin, that would be great.
Of course. So I'm currently a PhD student at NYU Stern, and it's a business school, but I'm one of the few psychologists in the business school, and I really, really care about what are people's psychology, the way they think, and their biases that prevent people from engaging in behaviors, especially building relationships that are actually mutually beneficial. And actually, the main thing that occupies my time recently is on play and how that strengthens relationships. So it can almost be viewed as the converse of ghosting. But I had the huge privilege of working with Nadav since, can you believe it, early 2020 on this project. And it was right when COVID began. So I think it wasn't, obviously we weren't excited about COVID, but it was very applicable to the context of everything moving online, and Nadav can probably speak to that a lot more too.
Thank you. Yes, Nadav, I'd like to hear about the work you do and what led you to do this as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very interested in how people misunderstand each other with the aim of helping them understand each other better. When I was a little kid, I would sit around in the school yard instead of playing ball or whatever. I would sit on the bench and the people would walk by, kids and teachers, and I would try to psychoanalyze them based on complete gibberish. But now I do the same, but with some evidence, so it's hopefully less gibberish. And it struck us at the time that ghosting, which is a fairly common behavior, is a particular behavior. It's particularly likely that people would misunderstand each other because ghosting by definition doesn't have feedback or doesn't have explanation for why a relationship ends or doesn't begin or doesn't continue. And so that seemed like a good place to start looking, basically. So here we are, a few years later.
Yes, I see. It's so fascinating. I would like to begin by sharing the definition of ghosting that I use on this podcast. I think there's so many definitions, and I just want to clarify that I'm using the Oxford Dictionaries, which is the practice of ending a personal relationship with someone by suddenly and without explanation withdrawing from all communication. And so this is different than leaving an abusive situation without a goodbye or disappearing after a boundary has been violated. And for your paper, I read that you defined it as the act of ending a relationship by ignoring another person's attempts to connect.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we weren't considering abusive relationships as one of the categories. Obviously, in real life, it is definitely exists. So I wouldn't also include that in ghosting. But we tried to ask our participants or people how they would define ghosting. And those are the things that came up. So ending a relationship, where there was an expectation of it continuing or there was an expectation of response. So it's the ending part that's important and the without an explanation part that's important. And if you think about it, it's kind of an odd behavior because when you're expected to do something, such as give an explanation or connect with somebody, people usually comply, they usually conform. Being a sheep is a very strong thing for people. So this is a little bit of a norm violation, like you're violating a norm, you're violating another person's expectation of you. So it is interesting that it's so common to see this behavior.
So I know this study contains 8 experiments. Could you please share an overview of this study in general?
There's so many ways to approach a research topic and ultimately write a paper, but I think both Nadav and I are very much what we call phenomenologically driven scholars. We're really intrigued by a social phenomena. We care about it, especially the psychology of it, and where this misunderstanding, as Nadav talked about earlier, arises. And I think based on our personal experience, because we both were honest enough to acknowledge that we both have been ghosters and ghosties in our lives. And somehow, when we are ghosting people, we don't feel like that bad about it, that guilty about it, even though it is a norm violation. Whereas when we're recipients of a ghost, it hurts us painfully. It's a really um difficult experience. So that led us to think, okay, there might be these misperceptions undergirding this behavior. And so why don't we begin with a really simple experiment, asking people to recall a time that they were either ghosted or have been ghosted. And because it's an experiment, everything else is the same in terms of like what the prompt is and the types of measures that they respond after that, but it's only that the perspective that they take is different. And we saw remarkable differences in what ghosties actually experience. So they felt like a lot more negative emotions. They also felt like the other party cared about them less, when in fact, ghosters actually cared about them a lot more. And they mispredicted the impact that they had. And so after these scenario experiments and recall studies, it was really important for us to find a creative way to actually reenact ghosting in a lab, so that you can take away all these other confounding factors that might cause reviewers and other readers to be like, wait, isn't this another extraneous variable? So so we recreated ghosting in the lab by getting participants to randomly be assigned to either be a ghoster or a ghostie. Obviously, we don't tell them these roles, and those who are ghosters, they are like basically engaged in a chat conversation with the other party. And after the first conversation, they then are move to the second screen, and they find out that there's this technical error and they have to wait for 30 minutes um, or more for this to be resolved, and they have the option to either stay and wait or to leave. And most rational participants would just leave because they will be compensated regardless. And but then the other party, importantly, the ghostie, they don't know anything. They don't know why all of this that's going on the other end. So they just think that the ghoster just left them without explanation. And so it recreates that experience, and then and then we ask them about how they feel and predict the other party's care for them. So I think that was the most cool study that we ran for this. And um, the final thing I want to mention is that in addition to the experiments, we ran 3 pilot studies that was really important to disentangle ghosting with other related rejection behaviors like direct rejection, ostracism, and that showed not through experiments, but like inductively using all the essays that were generated to code using text analysis on how it differs conceptually, and we also found evidence for that. So I think overall it's a really cool package using a lot of different methods to show that ghosting is real. It's a phenomena. It's something that's been neglected, and social scientists should care about this, and more people should study it.
Right. And it's interesting because in ghosting, the ghosters are always the bad guy, right? Because they are the ones that are violating norms and not responding back. But if you look at their perspective, and we also consulted, as Eugene said, our experiences, having ghosted others, um, uh, it's actually, it might not come from evil motives or misanthropic motives. Rather, what we find is that ghosters actually care about ghostees' well-being. And in fact, because they care to some extent, they ghost. Because the other option is to say to you, hey, we should not continue this relationship in one way or another. And they have this intuition that that would be worse, that would be hurt your feelings more if I tell you this than if I ghost. And it would make you feel rejected more if I tell you this than if I ghost. And it's just this mistaken intuition. In fact, the ghosties prefer to be told, even though it's an uncomfortable conversation, that people ghost. So what we find in some of the experiments is that the more pro-social, the more you care about the ghostie, the more likely you are to ghost as opposed to reject with an explanation. And it's just this misunderstanding. So it doesn't come from ill motives. In fact, ironically, it comes from empathy and caring for the other person that people decide to ghost. So it's an interesting error, it's an interesting misunderstanding that leads to ghosting in the first place, and also leads ghosting. You mentioned, Greta, in the beginning, how to reframe being ghosted. And I think one of the hardest things about ghosting, you tell us, is believing that the other person doesn't care about you or couldn't care less. But in fact, ghosters do care. And in fact, because they care, they ghost, which is just a social error, right? Not so much that they don't care.
There's a lot that you just said. And I think that, people ghost for many, many, many different reasons. And some people ghost because they actually do want to be malicious. And there was actually a study done on this, like ghosting in the dark triad as well. And some people ghost because they genuinely think the other person is better off just without them, or because they are just like, they want to say something, but maybe they don't know how to say it. Like
Right.
they don't have the words. They lack communication skills. So I would say that what you've done is great because it shows that this is why some people ghost. But I'm wondering if we could say, like, or if there could be another study on what is the percentage of ghosters that do this because of this reason or that reason or this reason.
So we also measure, so we just talked about motives for ghosting that are, I care for the other person, but because I care, I don't understand how really they would feel if they ghost. So I ghost because I think that's the caring thing to do.
Yeah.
We also measure self-interested motives, which is like, I don't want to feel inconvenienced, or I don't want to feel uncomfortable myself to have this hard conversation. And that's certainly there. Although it's not misunderstood by ghosties. In fact, for the most part, they kind of get the amount of self-interested motives. And then in the other part, so that we have, I care about you, therefore I ghost. I care about myself, or I don't want to be inconvenienced myself, therefore I ghost. And then we have another paper that YeJin and I are working on, which we call accidental ghosting. And by accidental, we mean, I really want to respond. I really want to continue our relationship. However, I either don't get around to it, or as you said, I don't really know quite what to say. And so I just don't do it. Kind of like, I really mean to go to the gym, but I don't quite do it, or many things that we procrastinate in our lives. And as time accumulates and I haven't responded, it becomes different. It becomes more difficult to respond. And so by accident, I end up ghosting, and I think those three possibilities are definitely, there's three segments of ghosters, right? There's the misanthropic, self-interested, there's the overly caring, and then there's the accidental, at least as far based on our research.
Thank you for that. That's really interesting. So I'm really happy that you're doing more research on this. And I wonder if after this accidental ghosting paper, you're going to be doing even more studies, or if there's something else you think researchers should focus on in the future.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's just so many opportunities. But one thing that Nadav didn't mention is that in our accidental ghosting study, we also care not just about diagnosing issues in the world, but actually solving them and like kind of fixing these perceptual errors. So we're preparing to run a study that is an intervention to reduce accidental ghosting. And it builds on existing work that tries to nudge people to engage in behaviors that they want to do, but they just struggle to do. So we provide people basically a template on like how to respond to a late email, for example, and with just like, you know, how to like be frank and apologize for not responding, and then responding to this the request that the other party asked you for. And just that template alone, we predict will reduce the amount of accidental ghosting. And so it obviously will not reduce all forms of ghosting, because those who have other motives wouldn't be like, you know, that those motives won't be addressed by this template. But at least for those who struggle with difficulty of formulating a response, we're predicting it will be effective. So that's something we're really excited about, and think that there's just a lot more room for more interventions to be designed and to help basically both parties in like in any relationship to be better calibrated in, you know, what's in their minds, what's in their hearts and souls, and to be on the same page.
Mhm.
Right. And it's kind of like funny to say, oh, well, you need a template for an email, a text message to respond to somebody, but it reduces the hassle factor. And sometimes that's important. Sometimes these bottlenecks are kind of silly. Like, why do you need a template? You could just write an email. Yes, that's true, but there's all these other things that a person does in a given day that just reducing a little bit the hassle factor or nudging them can help, because if you have an accidental ghosting situation, you really want to respond. So we're just making it easier for people to do so. Having said that, Greta, I think I surmise that you have, so far we've really analyzed ghosters, and I surmise you have a less sanguine attitude about ghosters than our research suggests, at least in some of the cases. So thought I'd float that into our conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. I did ask the listeners to provide their feedback on your paper as well. I'm going to read it. Keep in mind that my listeners are people who are really hurting after being ghosted. And so I have a lot of compassion from where they're coming from. So this is what somebody said. This sounds like an excuse on the ghost's part. Leaving someone in the dark and confused is the most evil thing anyone has ever done to me. When people answer surveys and researchers, they know what the correct answer is. People ghost because they are too cowardly to be accountable. Everyone deserves closure, and they know that communication is part of the responsibility of being in a relationship. I'm not sure who that research is supposed to help. Just gives people false hope that the person they dated is not exactly what they show you. It's not kind by any reasonable definition. It's always for selfish reasons. So that was the first thing I read.
Well, I'm glad people are not mincing words. It's very important to be direct in life. So, yeah, I mean, well, so it's possible sometimes that it is indeed a shirking of responsibility, and it ends up, the outcome of it is very hurtful. There's no question about it. But I think the bigger issue sometimes is that, I mean, I'll express my opinion, and then YeJin can chime in, but the biggest issue is sometimes we want to care for other people, but we don't know how to do that. There's a skill in that. And there's a lot of emphasis in our culture, last 10, 20 years about empathy and caring and so on. And it's one thing to have the intention of caring, but it's another thing to do it appropriately. And so sometimes when we care, by our intention, our actions that come from our intention end up hurting people. Okay. And it's helpful, I think, to address this misunderstanding. Obviously, some people indeed don't care, and they are misanthropic, and they are very callous and don't care about hurting other people. But to the extent that there's a segment of ghosters who do care, and they just think that ghosting is the more caring thing to do, if we can correct that misunderstanding, we can help a lot of people, a lot of relationships. So there's no denying that the outcome is very hurtful. We're not making excuses for anybody, but they're saying, is there a gap that could be closed so that some relationships end up with much better closure? Okay, because it's much harder to fix misanthropic motives, but it's easier to fix misunderstandings about how to care for others.
Hey, that's so well said. And well, first of all, Greta, and to your audience, I want to say I hear you because I've been on dating apps for a long time, and I've been hurt by so many men who were either ghosters or like breadcrumbers or like you name it, you know, they just don't know how to communicate. And my research has actually helped myself because I was able to reframe my default mode of thinking, which was, oh my gosh, like what's wrong with me, and internalize like, you know, issues about myself. And when in fact I'm like, okay, the data suggests that at least on average, ghosters do care, and it's more like they are they lack in skill, they lack in communication abilities, they're perhaps less mature, and all these other reasons that have nothing to do with me that led to this ghosting. And therefore I choose to reframe my way of thinking to you know, give myself peace and like elevate my self-worth. So we are absolutely not condoning ghosting behavior, but we want to give tools to ghostees, sorry, people who have been ghosted in the past, to you know, regain dignity and manage their relationships, even if someone has treated them poorly.
Right.
Thank you for saying that. Thank you for saying that. That was really helpful to hear. Exactly. Yeah, my takeaway with this whole thing is that, yes, some people may feel like disappearing, ghosting, it's the kinder option. It doesn't make it okay. It doesn't excuse their behavior. You know, as we all know, many mental health professionals consider ghosting to be abuse. And when you're ghosted, the sad thing is we just don't know what they're thinking or feeling. So what you said about reframing it is perfect. I would say if somebody's been ghosted, they're listening to this show and they just have this like they're ruminating on like, why did this happen? Why did this happen? You could lean into the radical acceptance of, I don't know why I was ghosted. And it's possible that this person was just really trying to avoid hurting me.
Right. And I think in general, when we have uncertainty in life and we don't have evidence either way, it's incumbent upon us to make a choice. We have to make a choice. I mean, even if we don't make it consciously, we make it subconsciously. And I think it's, as YeJin mentioned, it's easier to blame it on ourselves, that it's something about us that that person doesn't like. We can also make a different choice, which is to say, it's probably about them, which is probably more true than not, because most of, I mean, more than likely, most of the stuff we do is about us. It's not about other people. So if a ghost or ghosted, then it's about more likely about them than about the ghostie. The other point I want to make is that you know, most ghosties have been ghosters in the past too. So we can consult our past experience of ghosting others and ask ourselves, did we have ill feelings toward that person that we ghosted, that we never contacted again? And for most, I would suggest for most of us, it's not so much ill feelings. It's just either we were too busy or we had this indeficient skill of caring. We thought we were caring for that person, but in fact we weren't. So we have, many people have the experience of both being a ghoster and a ghostie, and that can also be a source of information and reframing.
I have another note from a listener. Somebody said, the kindness and wish not to hurt others by disappearing is more related to people-pleasing tendencies of the distancer, rooted in self-centeredness and avoidance to face their perceived sense of self and denial of how their actions affect others, and difficulty in facing the end of the relationship. I see it as another maladaptive coping mechanism.
Right. And you see this in business a lot, that people want to be liked. And obviously, it's natural. We don't want to be hated by other people. But the goal of being liked can carry a lot of problems. Okay. One of them is that you end up ghosting other people because you don't want to have a difficult conversation with them, difficult for you and maybe for them. And you want them to like you. So let's not have a difficult conversation. Let's just, ignore that responsibility. And it comes up in a lot of situations. One might be negative feedback. So if we work together and I got to give you corrective feedback, I might not do it, or I might sugarcoat it. Or it comes up with situations where there is a crisis coming and I don't let you know about it until it's almost too late because I don't want to have the conversation. I keep postponing it. So this obviously it makes sense that we want to be liked. It's very human. But if you take it to an extreme, then you're not going to have difficult conversations, and you kind of shirk your responsibility to have difficult conversations with people that you ironically care about.
Absolutely. YeJin, do you have thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, like building on that, just because like I have to admit that I'm also a people pleaser. I needed to learn how to engage in hard conversations, hard circumstances, difficult people in general. And one thing I learned a lot through cognitive behavioral therapy is to um learn to just shift the mode of your behavior from one of defend mode to discover mode. And we actually teach this in Stern's undergrad class. So I helped teach a class with Jonathan Haidt on like flourishing, and it's all about using positive psychology to help students become more resilient. And one of the first things we teach in the class is, okay, the currently so much of our life, whether it be technology or anxiety in general, is making us live like in defend mode. And it's like being very risk averse and try like choosing to interpret everything in around your circumstances something that's going to harm you, so you're trying to like flee and like um but actually humans are meant to live in discover mode and to be open to possibilities, to be agentic and um, be proactive with all that you have in your life. And that like simple shifting, ultimately the surrounding nature of the world doesn't change, but your mindset radically changes how you approach things. And it has also hugely affected how students began to form relationships, whether it be romantic or platonic ones, in undergrad. And just be, if someone is showing more avoidant behavior, um, you can choose to actually take the harder path of reaching out and I mean saying that this avoidant behavior might be good on the short term, but in the long term it's like not benefiting either one of us. And that helps people, like you also can change and influence relationships through that. So it's been really inspiring to see students change in those ways in their relationships. And I'm trying to work on it in my own life too, so that I can try to practice what I preach, but I'm definitely a work in progress as well.
Right. And I
I love
think to build on that, another intervention to help is to acquire skills of having difficult conversations with other people. Because if you know how to do that, you probably are less likely to ghost others, right? Because it wouldn't be
that.
as detrimental to the ghoster to have an honest conversation. And there are various ways of doing that. I mean, the intuitive way is like to tell another person, okay, we have to end this relationship, and here's why, or skirt around the issue, or sugarcoat it, or not wanting to hurt, and it's kind of a mess. And you enter a conversation like that with a lot of uncertainty, and you don't know how you'd behave, and so on. But you can also do it differently. You can solicit the other person's responses. So if you want to end a relationship, or if you want to end a friendship, you can ask questions. How do you think we're doing? Okay. What is going well for you? What is not going well for you? And then kind of engage in conversation with the other person, and then state your own opinion after the other person participated and they had a chance to say their piece. And of course, it's not going to make the conversation more pleasant, but it's going to make the conversation more reciprocal and more participatory. And at the end, even though maybe the relationship is over, everybody walks away still friends or still friendly without any trauma or any pain. And so if we can increase or better skills, if we have better skills, I think we can reduce a lot of pain due to misunderstandings.
I agree completely. I think open, honest, respectful, clear communication is key in relationships. And I definitely intend on having more podcast episodes that are dedicated to how to break up with someone in a way that's caring and considerate, or how to break up with a friend or a family member. Just like how can you do that? Like this is the whole next phase of my work.
Oh, I love that so much. And um not to like try to tie my messy research programs together, but I really think in-person relationships is huge in building the skill of having difficult conversations. So unfortunately, Gen Zs and whatever the next generation is called, where a lot of our communication relationships are increasingly going online, and that makes it creates more loopholes for to escape basically, and ghost and like engage in this maladaptive relationship behaviors. But when you're in person, you are forced to confront this person, and it also humanizes them because you actually see a person right in front of you, and and you have to like you see the humanity in them basically. And so through like in-person relationships, I really think a lot of these problems with their communication is like just like easily reduced and resolved. And in particular, what you do in these in-person relationships will also matter. And a lot of my work on play looks at how play helps you become more resilient, and helps form more like better communication abilities too. So I'm really excited that you're going to venture in that space and help people heal, you know, from ghosting and all these like negative relationship experiences.
There's other research that suggests that when we have looming negative events or something's like a difficult conversation is coming up, oh boy, I don't know how I'm going to handle this, and it's going to be awkward, or it's going to drag on, or whatever. The anticipation is often worse than the experience, right? You're anticipating it, and it's uncertain, and so you have visions in your mind of where it's going to go, and you always think about the worst possible outcome and the most extreme or emotional possible outcome. But the reality is that's one possible world, but for the most part, it's really it's less likely to happen than you think. Whereas in fact, once something bad happens, we have this natural psychological immune system that to some extent blunts the impact. And so if you tell somebody, unfortunately, it's time to break up, they naturally erect defenses because they're in the experience. Okay, so there's research on, so when you're an academic, so there's research basically that about people perceiving what breakup would be like, and people who actually have experienced breakup. And the people who have experienced breakup say it's far less bad. It's still bad. It's not great, but it's far less bad than people who are asked to think about it who are currently in a relationship. And the reason for that is when something bad happens, there's a lot of mechanisms that we use to reduce the impact. Okay, we think about the things, we do other things, we move on, we reduce the importance of the current relationship that just ended, and we think about why it might not have been good. We use something called hindsight bias, where we say, yeah, you know what, now that I think about it, it wasn't really meant to be, which is using our biases to help us, which can happen. And the biases that we have are adaptive to some extent, to make sure that we come out of the other side as happy as we were beforehand over time. So oftentimes it's the anticipation that kills you. And because the anticipation is so negative, you just never do it. You just never engage in the conversation, and you ghost. So just going through it often is far less bad than you think. It's like
Yeah.
a
And
Band-Aid.
it's
Rip it right off.
Yeah, it's so worth it. It's so important because otherwise you lose the opportunity to grow and maturely communicate. I mean, there's so many ramifications of ghosting. I mean, it's stressful. People feel stress, anxiety, shame, guilt. There's so many problems that can come along with being a ghost.
Right. And I think if you're a ghoster, if you've done it before, I mean, there's a sense in which you're exhibiting lack of self-confidence or lack of, I don't know, you're not doing an honorable thing. And when you don't do an honorable thing, that affects how you view yourself, right? And so you don't want to keep doing that in your life because then your evaluation of yourself will come down, right? Because you're acting in a way that's not particularly honorable. You are choosing not to have the difficult conversation, even though you know you should. And so looking yourself in the mirror is going to become harder and harder over time because the behavior that you have is inconsistent with sort of an honorable self-concept.
Well said. Is there anything else that you'd like to share with listeners about ghosting or being ghosted?
I don't know if this is my last words, but I can't emphasize enough the importance of like elevating like one's self-worth and the other party's worth just in general, and how that resolves so many relationship problems, including ghosting. If you um look the other person in the eye and like, wow, this is another human being like made so beautifully and wonderfully, then like I don't think it would be much harder to treat them poorly. And so I mean, ultimately we're not ghosting scholars per se, but we really care about like how do you help people live more optimally, and how to improve like organizations through that. And so um but perhaps that all ultimately boils down to like how you view a human worth, and always be conscious to, you know, elevate that.
Right. And I think another thought, last thought is it kind of matters how you enter a relationship, friendship or romantic relationship, whatever relationship. Because if you have clear goals and if you have clear, even more so, if you have clear no-nos, if you have clear limits and boundaries, and this is what I know, this is what I want generally, then it's much easier to end a relationship respectfully, right? It's when you're drifting, then that ending a relationship becomes harder because you never came into the situation with your goals intact and so on. And the same, I think, goes for both sides, right? I mean, a person, if you were ghosted, then uh, you partnered up with somebody who acted dishonorably towards you, okay? And so in both cases, both the ghoster and the ghostie, there's some reflection to be done, I think, about how you enter the relationship or why you entered a relationship to begin with. Could you have thought about yourself differently coming in, that then by the time it ended, it would have ended in a different way? That's mostly applies to the ghoster, but I think it applies to both sides. So the entry kind of matters as well coming in, I think, if that makes sense.
That's so interesting because we talk about ending conversations a lot. We almost never talk about like starting conversations. And like most friendships, they happen like they like start organically because you were like, you know, drinking with someone at a dinner party, for example, and you bump into them, and um you know, start with small talk, and small talk almost never is one that clearly sets your boundaries and who you are and what you don't like. And and like professional relationships, like same, or like it's very little of like self-disclosure. So that's such an interesting thought, Nadav. And let me mull on that for a bit more, and see if our next research project should be on starting conversations.
It's
Right.
funny.
I mean, it's hard to succeed in anything, including relationships, accidentally. It's possible, right? But even if you met somebody accidentally or by serendipity, the success of the relationship is intentional eventually, right? I'd imagine. So So the entry and the maintenance of the relationship is part of this conversation, I think. It's not just the ending is what it is, I think. So
Yeah, yeah. And I always encourage people who I coach, who I interact with, to reflect on the relationship and how they showed up. I think that everyone is a teacher. Ghosts are a teacher, and we can look back and say, well, wow, did they, was there some behavior that I maybe missed? Were there some red flags? But to also be really compassionate. Like, yeah, I didn't see the red flags because I didn't understand that that was a red flag at the time. And sometimes ghosts actually, when they do have certain personality disorders, they feed people exactly what they want to hear. They know how to move. They know how to be the perfect match kind of person. And so sometimes it really is impossible to predict being ghosted. In fact, in a lot of cases that I deal with, it's just like there were no signs and then it just suddenly happened. So if you do reflect on the beginning of the relationship, the ending, just always come from a place of love for yourself. And yeah, prioritize self-care, because when there is silence, we often fill the void with our deepest, darkest fears, our negative beliefs. And so just focusing on the facts and knowing that it is possible that this person really did this from what they considered to be a good place, even if it was misguided judgment.
yeah, we have to practice self-care because we only have one self. So if we don't care for the self, who will, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and then like just remind yourself that ghosting is a form of rejection, one of the more painful ones. And when you're rejected, it's physically painful. Research shows that it's actually like biologically painful. And so
Sure.
please acknowledge that pain and lean into other people in your life who care for you, because one of the best remedies for relational dissolution is to lean into those who are currently in your life who care about you and to fill that void rather than um, like ignoring it and just trying to move on, because it doesn't work that way.
Right. Yeah. And in the long run, you're probably better off, no? If somebody ghosted you, is that really, is that a long-term prospect? I don't know.
I personally am sad that I was ghosted, and I also am very intentional about who I allow into my life. And I want people in relationship to communicate with me authentically and honestly, even if it is hard.
Yeah. We have another study in that paper that asked participants to think about asking somebody who ghosted them for advice or help later on.
Mm.
It turns out that ghoster is actually much more willing to help than people think, um, which is, it's not the best thing in the world. Somebody ghosted you, then you ask for advice or help. But at least the hypothetical mental exercise of thinking that way, and the evidence suggests that these ghosters are happy to help, much more happy than we think, is also helpful in reframing. It means that it's not really about you, it's about them. Okay. And they don't hate you because otherwise it wouldn't have helped you, or they would not be willing to help you later on. It's just a glitch that they have.
I'm glad you pointed out Nadav, because ultimately um our human capital, the capital we have within ourselves, is super limited. Our social capital is like a lot broader, and how we take advantage of the relationships that we have really like influences your life's outcomes a lot. And so if ghost that study basically shows that ghosting has implications not just for your well-being, but like the how you perceive like the breadth of your relationships that you can tap into. So it has a lot of more tangible outcomes, if I may. So I hope that your podcast and all the other future ghosting research just helps people, take greater like control of their lives and um live in discover mode.
Thank you. How can listeners connect with you both and read the paper?
So the paper, is available. I think you just Google it and you'll find some sort of PDF of it. There also are summaries of it so I am in a school called INSEAD, INSEAD, and they have this magazine called INSEAD Knowledge, and so they created a summary of the paper so you can kind of read the summary. YeJin, I'm sure there's a summary somewhere on your end as well. So just Google us, and then you can just email us, and we will not ghost you because Greta, we know Greta sent you, so you're already good.
Absolutely. Unless it goes into spam, but I really hope it doesn't. But we will never intentionally ghost you. And please, yeah, we always love feedback. And Greta, I really love that you got your audience's feedback, because it's really nice to see like how people respond to it, and we love direct raw like honest feelings. So thank you so much for that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'll definitely link to the paper and put your emails in the show notes as well. And I just want to say thank you both so much for coming on this podcast, because your work is so important and integral to our understanding of this topic.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. We're excited. I mean, I did not know there was a podcast just really for ghostings. It's really cool to know that you exist and you're doing this great work. So keep up your great work.
Thank you. And listeners, please follow me at Coping with Ghosting on social media. And I invite you to join my free and private Coping with Ghosting Facebook support group. And as always, leave a rating for this podcast so other people can find it. And finally, remember, when you're ghosted, you have more time to connect with yourself and people who have stellar communication skills. You deserve the best.